You want to talk about conservatives flip-flopping here?
Yes.
Well, Dom Perrottet, who started out with such great promise here in New South Wales, rolling back health mandates, opening up the state, and we have to give him credit that basically he is the guy who is responsible for borders opening up to the world. Without him, that wouldn't have happened. But he gave in to the health lobby on masks, and then he re-upped that again for another month. And now he's gone and said that he's going to put the Aboriginal flag on top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge as a permanent thing, as a sop to Aboriginal activists and lefty activists who've been pushing for this for years. But the fascinating thing to me, guys, is that, he said, oh, this is a wonderful thing, blah, 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 blah. Now, but you go back just to 2018, and in the Daily Telegraph, my paper, he wrote about Luke Foley, who was then the Labour leader, who wanted to do the same thing. And he said, I have a great idea for Luke Foley. Instead of putting the Aboriginal flag on top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, how about just plonking a giant blank screen that can be quickly updated and easily updated to broadcast Labour's latest social justice warrior cause? We could call it the New South Wales Labour Party virtue signal. Maybe it could even be programmed to automatically shift with the wind.
Look, and as we saw, James, earlier with the China issue, China and Russia, led by two strong men in the old Soviet, old Maoist style, they're not going to waste a weak Joe Biden as president, are they?
Well, no, that's right. I mean, Joe Biden has created the weakest foreign policy the United States has seen, certainly in my lifetime, certainly since Jimmy Carter, that utterly feckless president of the United States in the late 70s who lost Iran, lost Afghanistan, and again encouraged the Soviet Union to run rampant around the world. This is exactly the same sort of circumstance we're seeing now, except we've now got China, who is actually, I think, far more dangerous than Russia. The Russian calculations around whether or not to go into Ukraine, I think there's an awful lot of brinksmanship happening on both sides, and Vladimir Putin is going to be considering an awful lot of things when he thinks about whether or not to do this, including the possibility of having to deal with another insurgent front in Ukrainian territory, which he's trying to hold. China, however, I think has no such qualms. They're the much bigger power in all of this. If they decide to make the Pacific a Chinese lake and evict, essentially, the U.S. by taking control of Taiwan, then we've got a real problem. And for Joe Biden to be talking about getting bogged down, in some sort of fight with Russia over Ukraine, I think is to really miss the main game. There's a story out of Collegiate School, which is a very, very, very posh New York City private school. I think their tuition is something like $50,000 a year, if you can imagine it. Anyway, their old logo was the old Dutchman. It was a winking Dutchman based on Peter Stuyvesant, one of the founders of New York, or New Amsterdam, it was then called. Well, they decided to appoint, with those $50,000 a year tuitions, a 17-person task force, including the wife of woke TV host David Letterman, who years ago was actually funny. I'm old enough to remember that, to update the brand to help it, quote, combat racism within collegiate and the institutional other racism that pervades so much of our society.
Amnesty International, James, put out a report today. They're calling Israel an apartheid state. I don't hear their criticisms about the Uyghurs in China and many other issues as vociferously as I do the Jewish state. I tell you, this is institutional anti-Semitism, surely.
Of course it is. It's completely institutional anti-Semitism. There's no other word for it. To call Israel an apartheid state when Palestinian Arabs can sit in the Israeli parliament, hello, I'm sorry, that's not what an apartheid state looks like. They should look at the current state of things on the ground, Peter. The Gaza Strip, that's not occupied by Israel. That's run by Hamas. The Palestinian Authority runs the West Bank. It is not occupied. There's not an apartheid system in any meaning of the word. And I'll tell you what, on many, many levels, including personal liberties, the rights of religious minorities, the rights of sexual minorities, Arabs have a much better chance and a much better life in Israel, in the state of Israel, than they do in the Gaza Strip, than they do in the West Bank. These are facts, and for Amnesty International to go and make Israel the great boogeyman of human rights when you've got China, when you've got Russia, when you've got all these other countries, deeply anti-Western, but I guess that's what they like because they're anti-Western, because that's what Amnesty International has become now. Then they just say, oh, well, it'll be like the Sydney Festival, we'll just beat up on Israel. Isn't this really the end point of all the critical race theory madness? You know, we've seen this for years developing with the Trayvon Martin case. We had the term white Hispanic. We've seen recently that when a black person attacks an Asian person in the street in New York City, that is somehow white supremacy. We've seen universities now saying, well, they're going to discriminate against Asians who are a minority because somehow they're actually white because they're too successful or something. Isn't this now really the toxic endpoint of this revolutionary idea now, where racism now no longer means, you know, you're racist because you think your race is superior or somebody's inferior, but that in fact you are going against whatever the woke revolutionary need and mandate of the day is? Absolutely, and they even have terms for it: white adjacent or white passable. These really racist terms into themselves, frankly, they're being used, and the worst part of it all is the patronizing of people of color and black people by the way they've created the structure. To say to a black person, you have no agency, right? You have no willpower. You have no personal responsibility because you're simply a victim of circumstance. And it's such a patronizing way to look at somebody of color, a black person. If it's incredible. It's an absolutely incredible thing. And that's why I think you're beginning to see people of color, Hispanics for sure, have moved conservative decisively over the last 10 years because they are fully against this woke culture. And you're seeing black people also say, enough of this. I'm a person, I'm a human, I have agency, I make decisions, good or bad. I should be judged on those decisions, not on this perverse pyramid you've created. Serious note, though, this idea that all racism is white on black, that has infected even groups like the Anti-Defamation League in the U.S., which had to change its definition, which a few years ago just quietly got updated to this critical race theory thing, which was about, you know, and there was systems of oppression where white people oppress black people. So if this thinking is oppressing or infecting, you know, even groups like the ADL, which should be standing up for a jury of all, you know, colors and sorts, it seems to me that you've got a very big cultural issue here in how do you break this?
We really have a big cultural issue right now. I think that within the Jewish community, and I'm not going to be specific to the ADL because I think they're doing the best that they can.
And they changed their definition again, so in fairness.
They did, yeah, they did. So I think that within the Jewish community, I think that what had happened in the past you know, a few decades is that the Jewish community was mistaken to feel that we're safe and that anti-Semitism is probably not that big of a deal anymore, in a way. So we kind of let things slide a little bit. And I think there has to be a cohesive, arranged response to all of this. One of the biggest problems I think that we're having right now is that a lot of Jews are going, wait, don't suspend her. They're going to be mad at me. Okay? I have a lot of friends that actually communicate that way. And to me, that's unacceptable. So we all have to rethink what racism is in that sense and understand that anti-Semitism, it's not just racism, it's racism that is specifically for the other, and that other is Jewish. So we all need to look that in the eye and actually work to eliminate that and realize that it's not going away anywhere anytime soon. It's still around.